They told me her name at the same time they told me she was a mistake, and for a long while I believed the second thing harder than the first. The Marrow sits at 9,000 feet on a spine of rock. The maps don't bother to flatter with a name. We named it. Every crew that ever froze up there named it, and the name stuck because it was true. The cold gets past your coat and your skin and the meat of you and settles into the marrow of your bones. And once it's there, it doesn't leave. Not on your rotation, not on your leave, not ever. Men came off that ridge walking slower than they went up. Some of them didn't come off. The detachment before mine lost two to a crevasse the storm had papered over with fresh snow, and the detachment before that lost their sergeant to a heart that just stopped one night in the dark, and nobody up there had the strength to dig a grave in ground like iron. So he waited in the cold shed until spring, which is a thing I will not describe further except to say that the cold keeps what you give it. That was the post they ran me out of the service on. Not officially. Officially, I was the senior man at a critical observation outpost overwatching a pass that mattered to people who had never stood in it. Unofficially, the Marrow was where they sent the ones they were done promoting. I was 41, twice passed over, too honest in a meeting once with a colonel who did not want honesty, and so I got the ridge that breaks men, and I ran it the only way I knew how, which was to keep everyone alive from one supply drop to the next, and count the days out loud so the younger ones would remember days still past. I had 11 men when the message came. Good men, mostly, the way tired men are good, slow to move and quick to complain and steady when it counted, because up there the only thing between you and the dark is the man next to you. Tors ran the radios. Kellett and Prout worked the generator that we prayed over more than any chaplain ever prayed over us. Young Danner was 19 and still thought the cold was something you could win against. The rest were shapes in parkas that I knew by their walks. We held the ridge and the ridge held us, and that was the arrangement. Then Tors pulled his headset half off his ear and said, "Sergeant, they're sending us a body." "A replacement," I said. "For who?" "Not a replacement." He frowned at the traffic. "An addition, Sergeant Coyle, reassigned to the Marrow, effective the next drop." He looked up at me the way men look up when they've read something that doesn't add up. "There's no billet for an addition, Sergeant. We're already one bunk short of comfortable." I didn't need it explained. You don't add a soldier to the worst post in the theater. You subtract from it. Adding one meant somebody somewhere had a name they wanted out of sight and a place where nobody important would ever look. The Marrow was that place. We were where careers came to freeze quietly. And now they were sending us a sergeant with a first name I hadn't been given, and a reason I hadn't been given either, and both of those absences told me everything I thought I needed to know. "She'll be off the mountain in 3 weeks, I told Tors. "First bad blow, she'll put in for a medical and they'll pull her, and we'll be back to 11 and short a ration line the whole time she's here." I said it the way you say a thing you've decided to be true. I said she, and I want to be honest about the weight I put on that word because I put a great deal on it and I was wrong about all of it. The transport came 4 days later. In the one window the weather gave us, a hard-nosed old bird that hated the altitude as much as we did. It didn't land. Nothing lands on the Marrow. It flared over the flat we'd stamped into the saddle and hung there in its own hurricane of rotor wash and ice crystals, and it kicked out the crates and it kicked out her, and it clawed back into the sky before the pilot had to think too long about where he was. She came out of the white with a rucksack that was packed wrong. That was the first thing I saw, and I want you to understand what it meant to me at the time, because I was a man who read soldiers off their gear the way some men read weather off the sky. Her ruck rode low and the load looked light, and the shape of it was all wrong for the mountain. No bulk of a proper sleep system riding up top, no bristle of pickets or pea, no ice tools clipped where a mountain soldier clips ice tools. It looked like the ruck of somebody who had packed for a place with roads. And she carried it easy, too easy, like it weighed nothing. And I filed that under green instead of under strong, because I had already decided which story I was telling, and a man will bend any fact to fit the story he's chosen. She walked up out of the rotor wash with her head down against the ice, and she stopped in front of me, and she did not salute, because up there we didn't. The cold makes ceremony a kind of cruelty, and she said, "Staff Sergeant Roan." And I said I was, and she said, "Coyle," and that was all. No first name offered. No story about why she'd come. No apology for existing, which is what I half expected from someone sent to a place like this. A little flinch. A little pleading in the eyes. Don't blame me. I didn't ask for this. She had none of that. She had a plain, flat face gone red at the cheekbones and pale everywhere else, and eyes that weren't looking at me the way soldiers look at a new senior man. They were looking past me, at the ridgeline, at the way the snow lay on the lee slopes, and the way the wind was combing the cornices, and I mistook that for a lack of attention when it was the opposite of a lack of attention. She was reading the marrow the way I read soldiers. She had the mountain half solved before she'd set her ruck down. I just didn't know yet that that was a thing a person could do. "You packed light," I said. It wasn't a welcome. I meant it as a verdict, and she heard it as one. "I packed for what I'll need," she said. "Not sharp. Just flat, the way you state a fact to someone who won't like it." Then she picked up a crate under each arm, crates that took 2 of my men each, and started for the shelter. And I stood in the rotor wash a second longer than I needed to, telling myself she was showing off, telling myself the light ruck was ignorance, telling myself all the things a man tells himself when he has decided a person is a problem and is not yet willing to consider that the problem might be him. That night I gave her the corner bunk by the cold wall, the one nobody wanted, the one where the frost crept in through the seam and you woke with your bag stiff on the outside. Danner had been in that bunk, and I moved Danner out of it to make room, and I did it in front of everybody so everybody would understand the order of things. She took the bad bunk without a word. She didn't ask why the good corners were taken. She rolled out a sleep system that was, I'll admit, exactly the right sleep system for the mountain, which annoyed me because it meant the light ruck had been packed by someone who knew precisely what to leave behind, and that didn't fit my story, so I looked away from it. "We run watches 2 hours on through the dark," I told her. "Everyone pulls the line. You'll take the deep watch, 02 to 04. I watched her face for the flinch. "The deep watch is the killing watch. It's the coldest 2 hours of the night, the ones where the temperature bottoms out and your body wants to shut down and the dark is total, and the only company is the wind working at the guy lines. We rotated it among the strong men, and even the strong men dreaded it. I gave it to her every night. Not once, every night. I told myself it was fair because she was new and had to earn the better slots, but there was no better slot coming and we both knew it, and that was the disrespect, plain as I can name it. I meant to break her with the cold before the cold got the chance to do it on its own. I meant to make the marrow quit for her." She looked at me, and there was nothing in her face I could use. 02 to 04, she repeated, like she was writing it down somewhere behind her eyes. "Understood." And she pulled it, the first night and the second and the 10th. She pulled the deep watch every night, and she never once put in a word about it. And every morning she was there at the stove when the rest of us dragged up out of our bags, and that was the beginning of the thing I couldn't explain, because men who are being broken get slower and quieter and start watching the sky for the bird that'll take them home. She got sharper. She learned the ridge in the dark. By the second week, she knew the sound of every guy line on the shelter, and could tell you from her bunk which one had iced, and which one had gone slack. And I know that because one night she got up in the black without a word and retensioned the windward line before it could saw itself through. And Prout, who had the watch, didn't even know it needed doing. The men didn't thank her for that. I have to tell you that plainly because it's the part I'm least proud of. Tors started calling her the mistake, quiet, not to her face, the way tired men make a nickname to explain a thing they don't understand. Ask the mistake, she's up anyway. And I let it stand. I let it stand because a nickname like that kept her in the box I'd built for her. And as long as she stayed in the box, I didn't have to look at the light ruck, or the way she read the cornices, or the fact that she had taken the killing watch every night for 2 weeks without once letting the killing part show on her face. The first time I saw what she really was, not the whole of it, just the edge of it, was over the stove, and it should have told me everything, and it told me almost nothing because I was still a man who had decided. The generator went in the third week. Kellett found it first, the way you find a dead thing, by the silence where a sound should be. The generator on the Marrow never stopped. It was the heartbeat of the post, the thing that kept the radios warm and the one electric coil glowing under the water, so we'd have something above freezing to drink. And when it ran, you stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own pulse. When it quit, the quiet woke Kellett out of a dead sleep, and he came stumbling down the shelter in his bag still half on him, saying the word we all dreaded up there, which was not a curse but was worse than one. "It's out. The gen's out." I was up before he finished. Prout was up. In a place like the Marrow, the generator is not a convenience. It is the second-to-last thing between the crew and the cold, the last thing being each other, and both of those things are thinner than you'd like. We crowded into the little linta where it sat, and Prout got a light on it, and we stood there in a fog of our own breath while he pulled the cowling, and started going through it with hands already going clumsy. And I watched the temperature of the whole post start its slow fall, degree by degree, the way you watch water rise around your boots. "Fuel line," Prout said. "Maybe, or the injector, I can't my hands." He was shaking. Everyone was shaking. Cold makes fools of hands, and a generator repair is fine work, and fine work is the first thing the cold takes from you. She came in without being called. She'd had the deep watch, she always had the deep watch, so she was already dressed, already moving, already the one person on the post whose body was awake and working. She didn't push Prout aside. She waited until he looked up at her beaten, and then she said, "May I?" And something in the "may I" made him move over, because it wasn't the voice of somebody taking over. It was the voice of somebody who already knew the answer and was giving him the dignity of handing it to her. She took her gloves off. "I want you to understand what that means at 9,000 feet in the deep cold. Bare skin on cold metal is a countdown. You get a minute, maybe two, before your fingers stop being fingers and start being liabilities, before the skin bonds to the steel and leaves itself behind when you pull away." She took her gloves off and she went into that engine with bare hands, and she worked fast, not frantic fast, which are different things. The difference being that frantic wastes motion and fast doesn't. She found the fuel line iced at a low bend where the cold had beaten the fuel's own warmth. She warmed it with her bare hands, one span at a time, breathing on it, cupping it, and I watched her trade the heat of her own blood for the life of that machine, span by span, and when it was clear she primed it and set the cowling and told Prout to pull, and he pulled and it caught, and the heartbeat came back into the Marrow. Then she put her gloves back on over hands that had gone the gray-white of bad cold, and she went back out to finish her watch, because it wasn't over yet, and she'd said she'd stand it. Nobody thanked her. That's the part. She'd bought us all another week of warmth with the skin of her own hands, and the men filed back to their bags grateful to be warm and vaguely resentful of the reminder that they hadn't been the ones to fix it. Torres said, "Lo, the mistake knows engines," and made it sound like an accusation, like competence was one more strange thing about her that didn't fit. And God help me, I said nothing, because to say something would have been to admit that a woman I tried to break with the killing watch had just saved my whole crew with her bare hands, and I wasn't ready. I stood in the returning warmth, and I watched the door she'd gone back out through, and I felt the first crack run through the story I'd been telling, and I turned away from it, because a man will do almost anything not to look at the moment he became the villain of his own account. She stood the rest of that watch with hands that must have been screaming. In the morning I saw the blisters where the skin had bonded and torn. She'd wrapped them herself neat, one-handed, and she pulled her shift on the line that day like nothing had happened. And when Danner, young Danner, who felt things the older men had trained themselves not to, asked her if they hurt, she said, "Cold hurts everything. You learn to work through the part that isn't going to kill you," and went back to her chores. I started watching her after that. Not kindly. Just watching, the way you watch a thing that has stopped fitting where you put it. And the more I watched, the less sense she made as a mistake, and the more sense she made as something I didn't have a word for yet. She never wasted heat. That was the thing I noticed once I started looking. Everyone on the Marrow bled warmth in 100 careless ways, left a flap open, stamped snow into the shelter to melt and steal heat, breathed into their bags and soaked them damp so the cold could get a grip. She didn't. Every motion she made was accounted for. She'd staged her whole existence to lose as little to the cold as a body could lose. When she came off watch, she stripped the frost off her outer layer before she came inside so it wouldn't melt into her bunk. When she drank warm and slow. She moved through that killing place like someone who had made a long study of exactly how it killed and had decided methodically to deny it every small foothold it usually took. I'd seen men survive the Marrow. I had never seen anyone manage it. She managed it like a craft she'd spent years learning, and I began, slowly, against my own will, to wonder where a person learned a craft like that. I didn't ask. Pride, mostly. To ask would be to admit I'd been wrong to write her off, and I wasn't there yet. So I did the coward's version. I went to Tours one night while she was out on the deep watch, and I said, quiet, pull her file. The traffic that came with her. There's got to be a line about where she's from. Tours dug for a while. The Marrow's records were thin, and half of what we had was corrupted by damp. But he found the reassignment order, and he read it twice, and he said, That's strange, Sergeant. What? There's no reason on it. He turned the screen so I could see. Reassignments carry a reason code. Disciplinary, medical, administrative request. Hers is blank, not redacted, blank. Like somebody pulled her out of wherever she was and just set her down here and didn't want a paper trail explaining it. He scrolled. And the origin unit, it's a code I don't know. I've been doing this 15 years, Sergeant. I know the codes, I don't know that one. I looked at that blank reason field for a long time. A soldier gets dumped on the Marrow. There's always a reason, and the reason is always ugly and always written down, because the whole point of a place like this is to be the written down consequence of somebody's mistake. Hers was blank. Somebody had gone to the trouble of leaving it blank. That's not the paperwork of a screw-up. That's the paperwork of a person somebody wanted gone, not punished, not processed, just gone, off the board, somewhere the light didn't reach. And I'd given that person the killing watch every night for 3 weeks and let my radio man call her the mistake. Don't tell the men, I said. Tell them what? There's nothing to tell, it's blank. That's what you don't tell them, I said, the blank. Because I was starting to understand that the blank was the loudest thing on the page. I still didn't ask her. I want to be honest about how long I stayed a coward. It took the mountain to finish what my pride wouldn't let me start. It took the sky closing over the Marrow like a lid on a pot. The blow came in from the northwest, and she called it before the instruments did. We had a barometer that worked when it felt like it and a radio forecast that reached us when the atmosphere allowed, and between the two we usually got a few hours warning of the big weather. That afternoon she came in off a water run at the melt pit, and she stood in the doorway a moment looking northwest, and she said to no one to the room, It's coming tonight. Big one. Multi-day. And Tours checked the traffic and the forecast had nothing, clear through the next day, and he said so, and she said, The forecast is reading the valley. I'm reading the ridge. And she started, without being told, to prepare the post for a siege. She overfueled the day tank. She had Kellett and Prout double-stake the shelter on the windward side, and she showed them a way to tie off the guy lines that I'd never seen, a friction hitch that could be released under load with a gloved hand. And when Kellett grumbled about the extra work in the cold, she said only, You'll want to be able to release these fast and blind later. Trust me now. Thank me never. She staged the emergency gear by the door where a man with frozen hands could find it in the dark. She filled every vessel we had with meltwater while the generator could still spare the heat. She did all of it quietly, without authority, without my order, and the strange thing, the thing I still turn over, is that the men let her. Tired, resentful men who'd called her the mistake for a month picked up her instructions and ran with them, because some animal part of them heard the certainty in her and knew, the way you know weather in your knee, that the certainty was earned. I could have stopped her. I was the senior man. I let it run. That was the first order I ever followed from her, and I gave it to myself, and it was the smartest thing I did on that mountain. I got out of her way. The blow hit at dusk exactly as she'd said, and it hit like the mountain had a grudge. I've been in bad weather. Everyone who serves in the high cold has been in bad weather and thinks they know what bad weather is until the mountain shows them the top shelf of what it keeps. This was the top shelf. The wind came up the ridge and over the saddle, and it didn't gust. It bore down, a steady screaming pressure that leaned on the shelter like a living weight, and with it came the snow, not falling but flying horizontal, a white so total that when I put my hand out past the doorway I lost it to the wrist. Whiteout. The kind where up and down and left and right all dissolve into the same roaring nothing, where men have walked off cliffs 30 feet from their own door because the world gave them no line to hold. The temperature fell off the bottom of what our thermometer could tell us. The radio went static and stayed there. The marrow was cut off from the rest of the earth, sealed inside a howling white shell, and inside that shell were 13 souls and one small stove and a woman I'd tried to break, calmly checking the guy lines she'd taught the men to tie. And 9 of my 13 were not in the shelter. I need to explain how that happened because it's the hinge the whole night turned on, and it was my doing, not hers. A patrol had gone out that morning, a routine sweep down the ridge to a listening point we manned in pairs, a day's work, out and back, nothing that hadn't been done 100 times. I'd sent them. 9 men, because with her on the post, I'd had the numbers to send a strong element, and I'd wanted them out from under my feet while she ran her storm panic, which is what I'd privately called her preparations right up until the sky proved her right. 9 men down the ridge, at the listening point, when the blow that wasn't in any forecast came up over the shoulder of the mountain and sealed the world. 9 men on the wrong side of a whiteout, on a ridge that breaks men, in cold that kills. And the only route back to the marrow ran along a knife edge with a cornice on one side and a fall on the other, invisible now, erased. A line you could not walk by sight because there was no sight. A line where one wrong step to the left put you through the cornice and down 400 feet, and one wrong step to the right put you off the face. I stood in that doorway with the white roaring past my hand, and I did the math that every senior man dreads, the cold arithmetic of a thing you cannot fix, and I felt the bottom go out of me. You cannot send a rescue into a whiteout. That's not caution, it's law, written in the names of every rescuer who ever became a second body to recover. You cannot follow a ridge you cannot see. If I sent men after them, I'd lose the men I sent and still lose the 9. And if I didn't, the 9 would freeze at the listening point when their small warmth ran out, sometime in the black hours before a dawn that might not clear for days. I stood there, and I understood that I was going to lose most of my crew tonight, and there was nothing in my 41 years of soldiering that could stop it. And I think I made a sound, because she was suddenly beside me at the door, looking out into the same white. "How many?" she said, not what's wrong, she'd already read it off my face. 9 at the listening point down the east ridge. My voice didn't sound like mine. There's no way to them, not in this. You know there's no way to them. She looked into the white for a long moment, not frozen, reading. I'd seen her read the cornices her first hour on the mountain, and I'd called it inattention. Now I watched her read the storm itself, the set of the wind, the rhythm underneath the roar, some structure in the chaos that her eyes could find and mine couldn't. And when she turned back to me, her face had the thing in it I would spend the rest of my life trying to describe to people who weren't there. Not confidence. Confidence is loud. This was quiet. This was a person looking at the worst the world could do and recognizing it. Recognizing it. The way you recognize an old adversary, and not being afraid. Because fear is what you feel before a thing you don't understand, and she understood. "There's a way," she said. "It isn't a good way, but there's a way, and I know it, and none of your men do. She was already moving as she said it, already at the staged gear by the door, already pulling the cord she'd coiled there that afternoon when I'd thought she was panicking. I need one man, strong, does exactly what I say, doesn't improvise. Not for the ridge, I'll walk the ridge, for the anchor line and the count at this end. She looked up at me. Who? And every reason I'd built for a month came down to this. I opened my mouth to give her Kellett, who was strong, and what came out was me. She looked at me a half-second longer than she needed to, and I understood she was deciding whether the senior man who'd given her the killing watch every night for a month could take an order cleanly when his life and 9 others hung on it. Whatever she saw, she nodded once. Then listen, she said, because I'm only going to say it once, and out there you won't hear me at all. What she laid out in the next 90 seconds, standing in that doorway with the storm eating the world, was not a rescue the way I'd have run one. It was something she'd clearly done before. I could hear it in the economy of it, the way every piece had a reason, and no piece was brave for the sake of being brave. She would go out on the ridge alone. On a running line she'd anchor to the shelter and pay out as she went, so there would always be a physical thread back to the marrow that a blind man could follow home hand over hand. She would not walk the ridge by sight, because there was no sight. She'd walk it by the wind. The wind comes over the cornice from the northwest, she said, steady, on my left cheek if I'm walking out. As long as it stays on my left cheek at the same angle, I'm on the line. The moment it shifts to my face, I've drifted toward the drop. The moment it dies on my cheek, I've drifted under the cornice's lee and I'm about to walk through it. The wind is the handrail. I read the wind. She said it the way another person might say I read a map. She had made a handrail out of the one thing on that mountain that was trying to kill us. My job was the anchor and the count. I would tend the line where it left the shelter, keep it from fouling, feel her progress through it. 3 tugs meant she'd reach the men. A steady haul meant bring the slack. A hard, repeated snatch meant something had gone wrong and I was to hold fast and not, under any circumstances, come looking. If it goes bad out there, she said, and here she took hold of my sleeve so I'd have it, you do not come out after me. You hold this end. You are the reason these men have a home to reach. A rescuer who abandons the anchor kills everyone who was counting on the anchor. Do you understand me, Staff Sergeant? I understand, I said, and I meant it, and it was the hardest order I ever took, because everything a senior man is built out of screams at him to go toward his people, and she was ordering me to stand still and be a fixed point in a storm. Then she clipped in, and she went into the white, and the white took her like she'd never been. I cannot tell you most of what happened on that ridge because I wasn't on it. I was the anchor. I stood in the lee of the shelter with the line running out through my gloved hands into a roaring nothing, and I fed it out foot by foot, and I felt her weight in it the way you feel a fish on a line, a live tension that told me she was still there, still moving, still upright. That was all the world I had for the better part of an hour, the thread in my hands and what it told me, and the cold coming up through my boots, and the men behind me in the doorway not speaking. Tors had the radio and kept working it, throwing our call into the static over and over in case anyone anywhere could hear that the marrow had men on the ridge. Nothing came back but the roar. The line went slack twice. Both times my heart stopped and both times it came taut again a moment later, and I made myself understand that slack meant she'd stopped to read the wind, to refine the handrail after a gust tried to lie to her, and that the taut coming back meant she'd found it. Twice she lost the mountain and twice she found it again out there alone in a white where I could not have found my own hand. And each time she found it she started paying out again, and the thread came alive in my grip. Then far out at the very end of what the line could reach came 3 tugs. Then a moment later 3 more. She'd reached them. I turned to the men in the doorway, and I don't know what my face was doing, but Danner made a sound and Kellett gripped my shoulder hard enough to hurt through the parka, and Tors stopped throwing his voice into the static, and just held the handset and stared at the line in my hands like it was a rope let down out of heaven. And then began the longest part, which was the coming back. 9 men, cold stunned, some of them past the point where they could help themselves, strung onto her running line one behind the other, and one woman walking them home along a handrail made of wind. She'd rigged it so each man clipped to the line with a loop she'd pre-tied. That was what the cord staging at the door had been, that afternoon, when I'd thought she was afraid of a forecast. She'd been tying rescue loops for a rescue that hadn't happened yet, because she'd read the ridge and known that if the blow came with a patrol out, this was the night it would come to. She'd prepared for the exact shape of the disaster before the disaster had a shape. And now she brought them in on that preparation. And my job at the anchor was to haul the slack as it came, to keep the line from fouling, to be the fixed and certain thing at the end of a lifeline 9 men were feeling their way home along in the dark. They came out of the white one at a time. The first was Ray's from the patrol, ice caked to his eyebrows, moving like a man walking in a dream, and Kellett and Danner grabbed him and hauled him into the shelter and into the heat. Then Akafor. Then 2 men half carrying a third between them whose feet weren't working right. Then more. I counted them as they came, the way you count anything that matters out loud so the number would be real, 6, 7, 8. And then a long gap, a terrible gap, where the line went taut and stayed taut and nothing came out of the white, and I stood there hauling nothing, feeling that live weight at the far end, and knowing there was one man still out there and her with him. The 9th man was Prout's brother-in-arms, Big Sakal, and Sakal had gone down. I learned it later in pieces, the way you learn the middle of a thing you only saw the ends of. Sakal had fallen coming along the ridge, gone to his knees and then past his knees, the cold having reached that place in a man where he stops being able to make himself continue, where the body decides the snow looks like a fine place to rest. A man like that is a dead man in minutes, and he is also, at 220 pounds of dead weight on a knife edge in a whiteout, a thing that gets rescuers killed. The book answer. I know the book answer. Every senior man knows it. The book answer is that you cannot risk the living for the nearly dead, that a rescuer's first duty is to come home, that you mark the position and you go on and you grieve later. That's the law that keeps rescuers from becoming bodies. She didn't leave him. She got him up. I don't fully know how. She was a third his size, and the wind was trying to throw them both off the face, and there was no ground to brace on that wasn't trying to kill her. But she got him up and she got him moving, some way she had, some patient terrible refusal, and the taut line I'd been hauling nothing against for 2 of the longest minutes of my life finally gave me slack, and I hauled it. And out of the white at the very last came the 2 of them, her under his arm, both of them frosted into something barely human, and my men took Sakal from her and carried him in, and that was 9. 9 out of 9. Every man who'd gone down that ridge came back up it, because a person I'd tried to break with the cold had walked out into the worst weather that mountain had in it and made a handrail out of the wind. She came in last. She always came in last. I'd learned that was simply who she was, the one who holds the door until everyone's through. She unclipped from the anchor line and she stood in the shelter dripping and steaming in the sudden warmth, and she did not say anything triumphant. She did not say anything at all for a moment. She just did the count with her eyes, touching each man where he'd been laid out by the stove. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And when the count closed, she let out a breath, one breath, and some rigid thing in her shoulders eased by a single degree. That was her whole celebration. A breath and a degree. The men were looking at her, all of them, the ones she'd saved and the ones who'd waited, and every one of them was looking at her the way you look at a thing you thought you understood and just discovered you never did. And I saw the nickname die in Tor's face, saw it die and something take its place that a man doesn't say out loud, and the shelter was full of that silence. The specific silence of a dozen men rearranging everything they'd believed about someone, all at once, without a word. I broke it. I owed her that much to be the first since I'd been the worst. "Sergeant Coyle," I said, and my voice was not steady, and I did not try to make it steady, because there are moments a man should not hide the shake in his own voice. Where does a soldier learn to walk a ridge by the wind? She was quiet a moment. She was working her ruined hands out of her gloves, checking her own body last, the way she did everything to herself last. And she said not to make a point of it, just tired and plain, on a bigger mountain than this one, a worse night than this one. And she looked at the 9 men breathing by the stove, and something crossed her face that I understood was old, older than tonight, a grief with a lot of years on it. I lost people learning it, she said. That's the only place anyone ever learns it, so I don't lose them now. I didn't ask the next question. She told me as much as a person tells when the wound is that old and that deep, and I'd learned, finally, that some doors you wait to be shown through. But Tors, who'd called her the mistake for a month and who now could not stop looking at her, Tors said very quietly from his radio corner, "The origin code on your file, the one I couldn't find." He wasn't asking to accuse. He was asking the way a man asks after something holy. That was a mountain unit. Wasn't it a real one, the kind they don't put on lists? She didn't answer him, but she didn't say no. And in the not saying, the whole shape of her came clear to me at last, the light ruck packed exactly right, the way she read cornices in her first hour, the bare hands in the engine, the handrail made of wind, the blank reason field, the origin code Tors with 15 years couldn't place. She was not a mistake they'd dumped on the worst post in the theater. She was someone they'd hidden there. Someone whose name had been quietly walked off the board and set down where the light didn't reach, at the top of a mountain that breaks men, where no one important would ever look. I didn't know the whole story, and I never got all of it. But I knew that much now, standing in that shelter full of living men who should have been dead. Whatever she'd been the best at it. And the world had put her here to be forgotten. The world doesn't always get what it wants. The storm blew 3 more days. She'd been right about that too. 3 days sealed inside the white, and in those 3 days the post ran differently, because the crew ran it her way now without anyone declaring it, deferring to her read on the weather and the gear and the cold the way you defer to the one person in the room who has looked into the thing you're afraid of and come back. I was still the senior man. She never once made me less than that. She was too good a soldier to. But I had stopped giving her the killing watch. The first night after the ridge I put myself on the deep watch, 02 to 04, the killing slot, and when she came to argue I said, "You've stood enough of these for both of us. Sit this one down, Sergeant. That's an order I'd be ashamed not to give." And she looked at me a moment and understood what the order was really made of, and she let me have it, which was its own kind of grace. On the 4th day the wind broke. It broke the way mountain weather breaks all at once, the roar just gone, and the silence after it was enormous. And into that silence, thin and crackling, the radio came back to life. Tors was on it before the first word finished, hauling the relief net in out of the static, and the relief net had been trying to raise the marrow for 3 days, because the blow that hadn't been in any forecast had rolled over half the range, and everyone downhill had spent 3 days assuming the outpost that breaks men had finally broken. Marrow, this is relief actual, do you read over? The voice was taut, braced for the worst. Behind it I could hear other voices, a room of them, a command post that had spent 3 days writing us off. Tors keyed the handset and his own voice cracked. "Relief actual, Marrow, we read you, post is intact, all hands accounted for." He stopped, swallowed, and said the thing that mattered, the thing that would carry down the mountain ahead of everything else. "Be advised, we had a 9-man element caught out on the east ridge when the blow hit. All 9 recovered, all 9 alive. 0 losses, over." The net went quiet, not static quiet, people quiet. The specific silence of a command post that had braced to log a mass casualty event and had instead just been told that a post everyone had buried had brought 9 men off a ridge in a multi-day whiteout, which is a thing that does not happen, which is a thing the book says cannot happen. Then relief actual came back slower. "Marrow, say again, you recovered 9 off the east ridge. In the blow, say again, over." "Affirmative," Tors said. 9 of 9. Recovered by a single soldier on a running line, walked the ridge blind and brought them home, over." Another silence, and then the voice on the far end, and you could hear the disbelief in it, The flat professional refusal to believe a fairy tale over a radio said, "Marrow, that's understood, we'll want the full report. Who's your rescuer? Get me a name for the record, over." And here she spoke for the first time. She'd been standing back from the radio, letting Tors run his net the way she let everyone do their own job. But now she stepped up, because a name was being asked for the record, and the record is a thing a soldier answers to. She took the handset from Tors, and she didn't give a name. She gave a call sign. "Relief Actual," she said, and her voice on the net was the same flat calm it had been in the doorway of the storm. "This is Longwinter." I did not know the name. Why would I? I was a passed-over staff sergeant on the worst post in the theater. But I watched it land on the other end of that radio, and that told me everything the name meant, because the net did not answer. The net went dead silent for a long 5 seconds, and into that silence, faint, not meant for us, I heard a voice at the far end say something to someone, and I heard a chair, I swear to this, I heard a chair scrape back, the sound of a man standing up, and then the handset over their changed hands, and a new voice came on, older, and this voice was not braced and professional. This voice was something else. "Longwinter," the new voice said, and it said the call sign the way you say a name you'd carved onto a wall you never expected to talk to again. "This is Relief Actual, but you can stop calling me that. You know who this is." She closed her eyes. It was the only time on that whole mountain I ever saw her do it. "I know who this is, sir," she said. "They told me you were gone," the voice said, and the whole command net was listening now, and every man in our shelter had gone still, because we were hearing something we had no right to hear, something private breaking open over an open channel because the man on the far end could not make himself care who heard it. "They told me you'd put in your papers and walked off into a civilian life and didn't want to be found. 2 years, Longwinter. 2 years I've had you listed as gone." A pause, and when the voice came back it was rougher. "And I find you running the worst outpost on my mountain, standing the line at a place we send men to be forgotten." She didn't answer that. She couldn't. The blank reason field, the origin code Tors couldn't place. 2 years of a name walked quietly off the board. It was all there in the not answering, and the old voice on the far end heard the not answering the same way I had, and understood it, and I heard him understand it, because when he spoke again there was a fury in it that had nothing to do with her. "Somebody buried you up there," he said. "Somebody I'm going to find." And then, gentler to her alone, though the whole net heard, "How many men did you just bring off that ridge?" "9, sir." "9," I heard him breathe. "You remember the Massif, the 11. "Every day, sir," she said very low. "I remember all 11. And I understood then, the grief that had crossed her face when she'd said I lost people learning it. Whatever the Massif had been, wherever the 11 had come from, it was the worst night on the bigger mountain, and she had walked 11 men off a dying mountain once, and it had cost her something she'd been carrying ever since, and they had taken that and turned it into a paper trail that ended at the marrow. And she had come to the worst post in the theater and stood its killing watch every night without complaint, and when the mountain came for 9 men, she had walked out into it and refused to lose a single one, because she had already learned, on a worse night than this, exactly what losing them cost. "Sergeant Coyle," the old voice had gathered itself back into command. "I want every man on that post to hear me. Is your senior man there?" She held the handset out to me, and I took it and I keyed it and I said, "Relief Actual, this is Staff Sergeant Roan, senior man, the marrow, over." "Staff Sergeant," a beat. "The soldier standing next to you walked 11 men off a collapsing Massif 4 years ago alone after her own team was lost. It's the only reason any of those 11 families still have a father or a son. She did it by reading a mountain the way the rest of us read a map, and when the citation came through, the powers that be decided a thing that impossible was easier to make disappear than to explain." His voice hardened. "She did not put in her papers. Someone put them in for her. And I am going to spend whatever's left of my career finding out who parked a soldier like that at a post like yours. But that's my fight. Yours is simpler. The old voice slowed, and every man in our shelter was standing now. I realized they'd gotten to their feet one by one without a word. The 9 she'd saved and the ones who'd waited, all of them on their feet in a shelter at 9,000 feet, standing at something between attention and reverence. Your fight, Staff Sergeant, is to remember for the rest of your life who was standing your worst watch. Do you understand me? I looked at her. She was looking at the floor, this woman who did not flinch at a leveled storm, unable to meet the weight of being seen. And I thought about the killing watch I'd handed her every night for a month. I thought about the corner bunk by the cold wall. I thought about the mistake, and the light ruck I'd read as ignorance, and the bare hands in the engine that nobody thanked. And I thought about the second I'd stood in the doorway and opened my mouth to send Kellett and heard myself say me instead, which I understood now was the first honest thing I'd done since she arrived, my whole broken soul reaching for a chance to stand beside her instead of over her. I understand you, sir, I said. I understood about a week too late, but I understand you now, and I'll understand it every day I have left. Good, the old voice said, because you don't get to keep her. A soldier who can do what she just did is wasted holding a ridge. Relief's coming up the moment the weather gives us a window, and when it does, Longwinter comes off that mountain and she does not go back into a drawer, not while I'm breathing. Relief actual out. The net clicked off, and in the ringing quiet that followed, in a shelter full of standing men, I did the only thing there was to do, the thing I should have done the day she walked out of the rotor wash with a ruck packed exactly right and a mountain already half solved behind her eyes. I came to attention. A passed-over staff sergeant, 41 years old, on the worst post in the theater, and I brought my hand up in the salute we never gave up there because the cold makes ceremony a cruelty. And it wasn't a cruelty now. It was the only warm thing in the room. I held it. And then Tors saluted, and Danner and Kellett and the 9 men she'd carried home, every one of them on his feet with his hand up, and she stood in the middle of it with her ruined hands at her sides and her eyes bright and refused, to the last, to let us see her break. Because that was who she was, the one who holds the door, the one who stands last, the one the cold could not reach the marrow of. The window came 2 days later. A hard old bird clawed up out of the valley into a sky she'd promised would clear, and it flared over the saddle in its hurricane of ice, and this time it came to take one soldier down instead of leaving one behind. She packed her ruck the way she'd carried it up, light, exactly right, nothing wasted. She shook every man's hand. When she got to me, she didn't shake my hand. She held it a second, the ruined skin of her palm against mine, and she said, "You gave me the deep watch every night." "I did," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't." "I know why you thought you had to," she said. "And I want you to know something, Staff Sergeant, because you're going to chew on this for years if I don't." She looked at me level, the way she'd looked at the storm. "The deep watch is where I learned this mountain. 02 to 04, alone in the dark, 3 weeks, that's where I read the cornices and learned the guy lines and found the wind. You meant it to break me. It's the reason 9 men are alive." She let go of my hand. "The worst thing anyone ever does to you can be the ground you save people from. I've had to believe that for 4 years. Now you get to." Then she picked up her ruck and walked out into the rotor wash, and the bird took her up off the marrow and into the clearing sky, and she was gone. I stayed. I finished my rotation and I took another one which no one on the marrow had ever done by choice. The men asked me why and I never fully told them, but I'll tell you because you've come this far. I stayed because she'd made the worst post in the theater into the place I'd learned what a soldier could be, and I wasn't ready to leave that ground. I stood the deep watch myself every night, 02 to 04, alone in the killing cold, and I did not experience it as a punishment. I experienced it as a school. I'd sit the watch and read the cornices the way she'd taught me to and listen to the guy lines and try to find the wind, and some nights, if the cold got far enough into me, I'd swear I could almost do it, almost read the mountain the way she read it, almost see the handrail in the dark. I never got as good as her. Nobody was as good as her. But I got good enough to bring 2 men off that ridge myself, a year later in weather that wasn't half of hers. And when they asked me, shaking, by the stove, where a staff sergeant learned to walk a ridge blind, I told them the truth. I told them a soldier taught me, on the worst mountain in the theater, on a night 9 men should have died and didn't. I told them she'd been buried up here by people who found her too impossible to explain, and that the mountain that was supposed to forget her was the mountain that gave her back. I told them her name, not the one on the blank paperwork, the real one, the one the general stood up for. Longwinter. And every time I say it, I stand up. I can't help it. Something in me comes to its feet the way that whole command net came to its feet, the way a shelter full of frozen men came to its feet at 9,000 feet in the dark. You'd stand too. If you'd stood the watch beside her, you'd stand for the rest of your life. She thrived where no one else could, on the worst ground they had, because the worst ground was the only ground big enough to hold what she was. They gave her the marrow to break her. She made it the place men learned to live.